YouTube. This is my weekly wrap-up.
I got my ticket for the long way round. 2 bottle whiskey for the way.
I didn't get a chance last week to do a wrap-up, so I thought I would go ahead and encompass 2 weeks into this wrap-up. So I read 6 books over that 2 weeks, and some of them were really good, some of them not so good. So let me tell you about them. In print, I read 2 books. The first of those was Dealing with Dragons. This is by Patricia Wrede, and it is the first book in the Enchanted Chronicle series. I read this, I finally finished it. It took me a couple of weeks to read it, which is kind of unusual for me, and it's really not a very long book. It's only like right at 200 pages, 212. This was just not for me. I was just having a conversation with my daughter Emma about this, she loves it, and I know that Giselle loves it, of Giselle Bradley. I will link her channel below, but she and I buddy read this, and she got really frustrated with me because I wasn't getting it done. She said, "Jen, you're fired." And I had to laugh. I thought, you're right, I should be fired. If I had not been buddy reading this, I probably would have DNF'd it. And the only reason is, it's not because it's a bad book. It's a really clever, sweet, hilarious book. The dialogue in this is very, very funny. And it's a fairy tale. But I just didn't feel like the characters had any depth. They seemed very one-dimensional to me. And the story, I don't know, I guess the world building for me there wasn't enough there. And that lends itself to the character building, which I felt, the characters were very one-dimensional. There was stuff that happened in this book that would just kind of seem to come out of nowhere for me. It's the story of a princess who's very frustrated with her life, and so she goes to live with some dragons, and typically in her kingdom, princesses are kidnapped by dragons. Well, she willingly goes and lives with them because she's so frustrated with royal life and it's useless stuff that she's being taught. So, if they had given me some reasons as to why the kingdom was the way it was, a little bit of backstory, just a couple of sentences about why all the royals, they just seem like idiots to me. And I thought, why? Why are they idiots? Why is there more to this? There are other princesses. There's one in particular that the main character befriends, and I wanted to know more about her. And my daughter tells me that the follow-up books to this, in the Chronicles, there are 3 more books, really do go into more depth. But I have a feeling it's not the kind of depth that I like. And while the writing was good, it just fell flat for me. I just didn't care for it. It's not my thing. But having said that, I think if I were 10 or 11 years old, I would absolutely love this. So I would recommend this. I actually gave this 4 stars because, like I say, I think it's a good book, but I think it's a good book for a specific audience. I think it's a young audience. So, yeah, 4 stars, being very generous. The other book in print that I read this week was The One by Kiera. I really enjoyed this. This is the 3rd book in the Selection series, and it kind of wound up the series. We got to know who actually got to marry the prince. If you know anything about this series, you know it's sort of like The Bachelor in dystopia. Anytime there's a prince that comes of age, any number of girls can apply or throw in their names to be considered, and then they choose 35 girls, and then they narrow that down to 6, and then they choose 1. So the prince has to be the one that chooses, and in these books there's a fair amount of political stuff that's going on having to do with the dystopian society in which they live. So that lent some more to the story, and we get a lot more of that in this 3rd installment. But, I actually went out and bought this the day it came out, which I never do. But I wanted to see how it ended. I would have listened to it on audio, but I don't like the narrator. It's Amy Rubinate, and I just don't care for her. And again, that's me. So, yeah, I gave this 4 stars, a solid 4 stars, and I really enjoyed it. The other 5 books I read were all on audio, and the first of those was Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. This was narrated on audio by Elizabeth Evans, and it is the 2nd book in the Throne of Glass series. There are actually 3 books in this series that are currently out. One is a compilation of several novellas that's sort of a prequel to Throne of Glass. So you can read those first or not. They're all narrated by Elizabeth Evans on audio. And I've started the novellas, even though I've read the first 2 books. And I have to say that the voice that Elizabeth Evans is giving to the prequel main character, who is named Selena Sardathian, she's an assassin. The prequels are all about her early days as an assassin, and she's kind of not very likable. At least on audio, she's not. Anyway, I loved Throne of Glass, but I really loved Crown of Midnight. We follow in Throne of Glass, Selena is an assassin, and she becomes the king's champion. And that's basically his assassin. So Crown of Midnight picks up with her in the king's employ, basically, and he sends her out to assassinate several people. Well, the book deals a lot with her trying to understand why these people deserve to be assassinated. So you have a lot of her inner conflict going on, and while Throne of Glass had a lot of action, Crown of Midnight dealt a lot more with the inner workings of the king's court and the politics and just the character growth alone. You know, you took these characters and Sarah J. Maas just really capitalized on them. She grew them along. She really developed them. There were relationships that were in place that really changed. They morphed into something else. They really deepened. And, you know, that was such a pleasure to really, you know, experience. There were a lot of revelations, new things that Selena discovered, and the identities of people were revealed, and it was just wonderful. I gave that book a solid 4.5 stars, and I'm really looking forward to the continuing series. This is not a trilogy that will wind up with the next book. The next book is called Heir of Fire, and then there are more books planned beyond that. So this series just gets better and better. So I'm really looking forward to the next one. The other 4 books I read were all part of a series, and it is the Marked Men series by J. Crownover. And again, I listened to each of them on audio, and this is New Adult Contemporary. A lot of times what they'll do is take 2 main characters, and then you have secondary characters, and then the next book will pick up with a couple of those secondary characters, and it just keeps going on. This series does that. So we start with Rule. Rule is the first book in the series, and it follows Rule. Rule is a wild child. He's crazy, rebellious, doesn't want anything to do with his family. He had an identical twin brother who was killed in a car accident, and in particular, on his way to pick up Rule, Rule was drunk and couldn't drive or something like that. So Remy, who is the identical twin brother, gets killed. The other main character in the story is Remy's best friend, who really, he pulled into their family. She's not technically part of their family, but she's very integrated into the family. And in fact, the older brother considers her a younger sister. So she and Rule have a very antagonistic relationship. So it's the story of their romance. But here is what I absolutely adore about this series. J. Crownover has taken the basic formulaic plot. She takes that concept, but she really delves into some deeper issues. And so many of these authors try that, and it just completely falls flat. Not in this case. She went there, and she did it really well. This particular book deals with loss because it's the grief of losing an identical twin brother. I mean, every time Rule looks in the mirror, he sees his brother looking back at him. And so he has to overcome that. He has to overcome the guilt that he feels. There's a lot of blame in the family. The family gets completely fractured by this. So you watch that family dynamic change, these issues of guilt and blame and abandonment and grief. You know, the loss of a child, the loss of a best friend, just really well done. And I liked the characters. The book was narrated from 2 points of view, as are all the books in this series. But in this particular one, Sophie Eastlake was the voice of the female protagonist. Her name is Shaw. And then Rule, the main protagonist, was narrated by Michael Rahal. I gave that book a solid, again, 4 stars. Really enjoyed it. Followed it up immediately with Rome. And this follows the older brother of Rule and Remy. And he's just come back from a tour in Afghanistan, and so he's got elements of PTSD going on. He doesn't know how he fits into this family that's been, again, fractured with the loss of his brother. So you have that added kind of dimension of his struggle to figure out who he is. And again, romance. It's Rome and then Cora. And this was my favorite of the series. And it's actually the third book. There's another book in between, but I'd heard that this was better than both the first two books, so I went ahead and jumped ahead. And it was fine to do that because this character is so integrated into the first book. So loved it. Loved the narration. I thought the narration was spot on. And it was narrated, again, from 2 points of view by Alicia Neal and William Sharp. Absolutely. I can't say enough about this narration because they really made the characters come alive. And again, my favorite book, 4.5 stars. Then I went to Jet. Jet is the second book in this series, and Jet is a rock star. And he has a relationship, kind of a friendship that morphs into more of a relationship with one of the main characters from the first book, her best friend. And so, again, story of their romance. But the stuff that book has to deal with is an abusive relationship with a parent and also an absentee parent and a brother that gets into a lot of, like, mob stuff. She went there with these issues, did a really good job with them, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I gave it a solid 3.5 stars, rounded up to 4, mainly because of the narration on the book. The narration was done by Callie Dalton from the female perspective, and then Cal Wembley, who is actually Kirby Hayborn from Jet's perspective. And Kirby Hayborn is okay. He did a lot of the Abby Glines Seabreeze series. And I like him okay, but I don't love him. And by comparison, because I had just read Rome and that narration was so fabulous, it kind of paled. So it was okay. Like I say, 3.5 stars for the story and then rounded up to 4. And great setup to Rome. And then again, Rome was a great setup to the fourth book in the series, which is Nash. I really, really liked Nash. I don't think I liked it as well as Rome, but I loved it more than the first 2 books. I thought it was a great improvement. The characters were interesting. Well, first let me tell you, this was narrated again from 2 points of view by Paula Costello and Tad Branson. I loved the narration. I thought Paula Costello did a really good job with the female protagonist, and this book dealt with the death of a parent and also with bullying. And actually, a lot of it had to do with bullying because the female protagonist has something that happens to her in high school, and it scars her and really wounds her deeply. And she has a lot of, preconceived notions and hurt, just flat out hurt, that she's got to overcome in order for this romance to work. And then, of course, the male protagonist, Nash, is dealing with the death of a parent. And excellent story. I loved the romance. I loved the characters. The female character, I know there are people who've read this book that didn't like her very well. And I think, she's not terribly likable in the beginning because she's just got a lot of junk that she's got to move through and get past. And it's hard. Bullying is a bad thing. It will scar you for life, and it will leave you with a lot of things that you just have got to learn how to get past. So, excellent book. I gave it 4.5 stars and thoroughly enjoyed it. So that was my last couple of weeks, and I have a lot of things going right now that I'm kind of dipping in and out of, like 2 or 3 things on audio, and then I've got a couple of books in print and some ebooks that I'm finishing up. In fact, one is really good, and I'll tell you all about that next week. In the meantime, if you've read any of these books that I read this past week, and you have an opinion or you loved them, hated them, please let me know. I would love to know your thoughts on any of those things. So that's it for now. I will be back on Friday with Friday Reads. And so until then, thank you so much for watching.
I'm gone. You're gonna miss me when I'm gone. You're gonna miss me by my walk. You're gonna miss me by my talk.